we can actually start. Hila?
Can.
Hey, if you can let us know when we're actually starting.
Yeah, I'll tell you.
Good.
You should see me now.
We can see you perfectly. We're going to start in a couple minutes. Just waiting for the people to join in, and then we can kick this off. Hila, let us know when we can start.
We can start.
All right. Good morning, everyone joining us today for this special webinar. This topic is dear to our heart and very important as far as we're concerned. And we'd like the opportunity to discuss the scale of IUU fishing and how it is changing the geopolitical game. I'm honored to be joined today by three exceptional individuals. With us this morning is Mr. Vikram Sinha. He's the former Deputy Assistant Secretary for Defense for South and Southeast Asia. Mark Powell, PhD, world-renowned expert in IUU fishing and CEO of Ocean Insight. And Mr. Nadav Lieberberg from Windward, he's a senior analyst and a subject matter expert. And I thank you all for joining me today. We've been hearing a lot over the news in the past few months, especially about this topic. It's not only a prize of NGOs around the world looking for the illegal aspect. We do see a lot of governments talking about this growing trend. We see and hear a lot of affiliation to a great power competition, forced labor, and other topics that we're going to cover today. Vikram, let me start with you, sir. What's changed? Why now? Why do we see such a growing interest nowadays?
Yeah, hi, Matan. Thank you so much, and thanks for inviting me to join you. And Mark, privileged to share a panel with you. True expertise in this area, in the details. You know, IUU fishing. Why now? I mean, I've been thinking about IUU fishing for certainly more than a decade. When I was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, we already recognized it as a critical challenge for long-term stability, especially in the Pacific, where the protein requirements of billions of people, when you take the population of China, the ASEAN countries, alone, you're at 2 billion people, depend heavily on fishing stocks, and just overfishing, even through legal means, was already seen as a problem. And the burden of enforcing IUU fishing, it's just sort of one of those vexing challenges. It's very difficult to enforce. The international law is complicated. In international waters, jurisdiction is really limited to the flag state of the fishing vessels. In exclusive economic zones, when there are violations, it tends to be very difficult for states with low capabilities to monitor and or enforce in those areas. If you think about it, the assets that have traditionally been used to deal with this kind of illegal activity at sea are really expensive and complicated. Coast guards, ships are expensive, crews are expensive, training's expensive. Technologies for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, what we call maritime domain awareness, are difficult. But what's happened in the past 10 years, and really in the past few years, has been sort of just a large-scale expansion, and I'd say even an explosion in terms of the volume of IUU fishing. And then there's also been a shift, whereas China, even a decade ago, was viewed potentially as a partner, at least in some areas of enforcement and establishing rules and norms. China's chosen sort of a twofold strategic pattern of behavior in the region. Within what it considers its territorial waters, i.e. the disputed waters of the South China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, out into the Sea of Japan. In that area, China has basically started to use its long distance deployed fishing vessels as a hybrid force. So they're both fishing in the EEZs of other countries or in disputed territories, but they're also using their fishing fleet as a means for intelligence, reconnaissance, tipping and queuing for their own Coast Guard and naval forces, and basically for intimidation of neighboring states to try to de facto gain control of waters that they dispute. And then when you go beyond that, past the second island chain, out into the Pacific, the Chinese have been actively using their long distance fishing fleets, both to procure the resources and also to just demonstrate that China is essentially able to operate unilaterally and beyond the reach or enforcement of states, let's say like Peru or Ecuador or Chile, who again would be very constrained in what they can do to monitor and enforce in their EEZs or in international waters. And so while it's been a long-term problem, while a lot of states have been both trying to enforce it when it comes to their territory, but maybe even participating or supporting IUU fishing activities in other areas, today, two factors really have brought it to the fore. It's becoming more and more critical in terms of the impact it's having on livelihoods and security. Climate change is also severely degrading fisheries and contributing to basically a crisis in many areas. So there's this humanitarian and human toll. And then China in particular has chosen to, in essence, weaponize IUU fishing and start using it as a tool of its geopolitical statecraft and ambitions, which have made it an interesting arena for other countries, the United States, its allies and partners, to start to see as an area of competition, and where the interests they have in constraining bad behavior by China and the interests of the region in protecting their fish stocks and protecting their economic livelihoods, in preventing environmental degradation, actually come together. And that's why you see things like this Quad initiative on maritime domain awareness, where India, the United States, Australia, and Japan have recently said they were going to cooperate to help share more data and information with countries in the region, specifically aimed primarily at managing IUU fishing. Sorry, that was a little bit long-winded, but I'm really looking forward to this discussion. Thanks.
No, that's such an important topic, and your points are spot on. I think that we're going to share some example that resonates exactly to what you illustrated. But before that, Mark, if I can pass the baton to you and maybe talk about this from the domain expertise area. What do you see from the behavior or from the methods maybe in correspondence to what Vikram shared about the Chinese fishing fleet. Can you speak a bit about that, please?
Yes, thanks, Matan. And thank you, Vikram, for the great introduction to the issue. My personal experience with the issue dates back to when I was quite young and fishing with my father on his salmon fishing boat off the coast of Oregon. And at that time, the big bad boats fishing just outside the territorial limit were Russian trawlers. And so a lot has changed, but it is a reminder that the issues are not brand new. I mean, definitely true that the issues have gotten worse over the years, but we've seen examples over many years. And in some cases, they're very complicated. The issues of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing, I mean, there's a reason people have captured those together under one tent, because sometimes the borders are unclear between the issues. And if you can see some bad fishing behavior, it's not always obvious which category it falls into. The Chinese are definitely the world's leading character in IUU fishing. I've worked in the South China Sea and seen the issues that Vikram's talking about. The Chinese fleet is huge, and in some cases, it's not acknowledged by the Chinese government. I was an expert providing information to the ODI study that found over 16,000 distant water fishing vessels, Chinese-owned, Chinese-operated, or various tight links to China. And that number is not acknowledged. The government acknowledges about 3,000. So there's even a real problem in scale that the government won't acknowledge. They're vessels of all types. They fish everywhere, and they carry out illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing. In some places, it may not be, people may not be aware of this, but there are places in the oceans right now where fishing is entirely unregulated. So outside the territorial limits of Argentina, there is an international fishing zone with a rich squid resource. And there's a lot of boats that fish there, most of them Chinese, and there is no management authority. So the fishing that's done there is entirely unregulated. It's probably mostly unreported. There's no one to report it to except for the FAO, and there's really no strong requirement for that. And so the vessel types that are out there can catch a lot of squid. There are some new vessel types that are present in the region that are capable of fishing more efficiently. They can operate with a smaller crew, and they're more flexible in what they can catch, and that makes the Chinese fleet even more difficult to manage and understand. There are certainly examples in the news media of recent cases of governments attempting to enforce. And for example, there's a prominent example off the coast of Argentina a couple of years ago where the Argentine Navy attempted to seize a Chinese vessel fishing illegally, and other Chinese vessels blocked the way. They interposed their vessels between the pursuing government vessel and the Chinese vessel that was being sought. So there are many different sorts of problems. The fishing by Chinese vessels is aggressive. They tend to overwhelm local fleets, and as Vikram mentioned, there are many reasons why we care. Chinese fishing can basically supplant or replace local fisheries. Off the coast of Peru, Peruvian fishermen have for decades caught squid, and their squid catch has gone down in recent years at the same time as the Chinese squid catch has gone up. We don't have definitive proof that that's a replacement, but the evidence is there. It looks like the Chinese catch is forcing the Peruvians to make do with less, hurts the local economy, and it can also undermine the ocean ecosystems in the area to such a point that productivity is decreased for other species than the target species. For endangered species, seabirds, sharks, marine mammals, sea turtles. We've seen some evidence of sea turtle declines off the coast of Peru, potentially tied to Chinese distant water fishing. So it's a big, widespread problem. It's hard to get a grip on, and recent developments in monitoring and enforcing hold promise, and that's what we're here to talk about today.
Absolutely. And as you said, this is kind of both a challenge in terms of scale, right? It's very hard to measure the scale, and obviously we do see part of the impact, but not all of it. By design, it's a very opaque, both the nature of the vessels and the way they operate. We at Windward do everything in our power to bring visibility using maritime AI and other advanced tools. And with your permission, I would like to ask my colleague, Nadav, maybe to put some numbers behind those trends and try to quantify this a bit from the way we see it. Nadav, can you please talk about, from a data perspective, how does it look?
Certainly, and thank you for that, Matan. Kind of reiterating and lingering on that last point that was made by Mr. Powell. Obviously, when we look at Windward at this phenomenon from a data perspective, the trends are pretty obvious as they've been seen through the data. With Windward, we took the liberty to try and measure and quantify those numbers in order to get a better sense of the phenomena, whether it grows, it stays the same. And the numbers are alarming. Just by examining fishing operations from all kinds and from all natures, focusing on the South Atlantic as well as the North and Southeast Pacific Ocean, we've been seeing a tremendous increase in the number of activities over the last 2 years alone. In the graph in front of you, what you are seeing here is just the staggering amount of fishing operations that continuously increase in those areas, mostly performed by vessels from Chinese origin, where they're operating with a Chinese flag or falsely reporting their flags, but are coming from Chinese origin. And the numbers are 4.5x's compared, just looking at the last 2 years alone. Now, this trend represents the growing concern of us all of this situation because of its environmental impact, as well as from its security impacts that it lies there. But obviously, this is just solely from a data perspective, seeing how the fishing operations in those areas are seen, supporting some of the discussion points that we have been discussing thus far.
Yeah, no, that's really impactful, Nadav, and thank you for sharing this. Obviously, both Vikram and Mark, you talked about China, and we do see here on the data set that there is a growing amount of Chinese fishing fleet. Nadav, do you want to share some information maybe on, we're talking a lot, we hear a lot of great power competition, how this comes into effect from the data standpoint? Absolutely,
I'd love to talk about that. When we talk about great power competition, obviously there are a few angles that are worth discussing. What I'd like to bring into this discussion right now is part of the data angle and what that data actually means. So picking and choosing a particular area where the Chinese distant water fishing fleet has been mostly active, looking at the South Pacific and the North Pacific Ocean, for example, we're seeing that at any given moment throughout time, there are at least 3,000, close to 3,000 vessels, between 2,000 to 3,000 vessels that operate outside of China's mainland. And the snapshot that you're seeing right now is an illustration of a particular date from the past 6 months, representing the location of nearly 2,400 Chinese distant water fishing vessels that operate outside of the mainland. But when we take this data, just by looking at this data alone, and we compare the numbers of fishing vessels, Chinese distant water fishing vessels that operate in the Pacific Ocean, and we compare it to the number of vessels that are permitted, legally permitted to fish, by combining multiple RFMO databases that would include the WCPFC, as well as the IATTC and the SPRFMO list of registered vessels, we are only looking at 1,700 vessels, give and take, that are permitted to fish in those areas, essentially have obtained a fishing permit, but that number still stands at about 75% of the total population of fishing vessels that actually operate in the Pacific at any given time. And this is just by looking at the Pacific alone. As Mark mentioned, there are likely to be 1,600 1,000 vessels operating, on a global scale when looking at a distant water fishing fleet. Now, just by looking at this number alone, we understand that when we just look at what is being reported to authorities through the current mechanisms of the RFMO listed fishing vessels, that still stands for about 75% of what is really out there. So our assessment based on the given data is that there is roughly 25% more fishing vessels that operate just in the Pacific Ocean alone.
Yeah. So, Vikram, if I may ask you, as a former policymaker, if this is something, and again, this is the area of interest or the AOR that was under your direct supervision, how do we tackle this? What are the means to actually address those issues? Obviously, Quad initiative is a great step forward. Can you address this point, please?
Yeah, I mean, this isn't some sort of an official rubric, but in my mind, the way I look at managing this kind of multinational issue, something where you're trying to protect essentially a global resource in the global commons, you sort of have you have three baskets. You have policy, you have monitoring, and you have enforcement, right? And obviously, sitting in your own territorial waters, you can set the policy, you can do the monitoring, and you can do the enforcement. When you get out into your EEZ, it gets more complicated. And as Mark was mentioning, when you get out in areas that have no governing authority of Argentina, once you're in international waters, it gets even more complicated. On the policy front, there's sort of three arenas: the formal international policy arena, the sort of multilateral, minilateral arrangements like the Pacific Islands Fisheries Forum, like the Quad. So some are formal structures, some are more informal initiatives, but where states collaborate and decide they want to do something about these issues. And then there's your own domestic policymaking. For the United States, this is essentially both the monitoring and enforcement fall really under the Coast Guard, with a lot of coordination with the Department of State, Department of Defense. For us out at the Indo-Pacific Command, JIATF West, Joint Interagency Task Force West, is where a lot of the nexus of the law enforcement and the military and the Coast Guard capabilities come together, and you can start partnering. So you can think of a lot of areas where you could innovate. So for example, if we made it our policy to give a mission to the Department of Defense to assist, to be more active in support of an IUU fishing mission that was led for the United States by the Coast Guard in collaboration with partners. The Coast Guard, U.S. Coast Guard has an IUU fishing strategy, for example, but by policy, we can direct more resources to go towards that, to provide, for example, the monitoring capabilities. Or for enforcement, you can do very interesting things like, so I can't enforce as the United States anything on a Chinese vessel in a Chilean EEZ, or an Argentine EEZ, or in the South China Sea in someone's EEZ. I could potentially let them put their own maritime enforcement personnel on one of my vessels, on a US Coast Guard vessel, and then let them utilize that for enforcement, sort of a ride-along kind of thing. That is a practice that is undertaken. That could be institutionalized and grown, where more capable states, Japan, Australia, the United States, Korea, could help less capable states by partnering on those assets. But then we come to the space where you guys are operative. The intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets of countries are generally thin when it comes to things that aren't viewed as hard security interests. So while we might be dedicating a lot of resources to looking for a missile launch from North Korea, or what they're doing with a submarine or something like that, we're probably devoting a lot less to the fishing fleet writ large. And in the last few years, especially, last 20 years to some degree, but really coming to a head in the last few years, commercial capabilities and new breakthroughs in areas like what you guys do in artificial intelligence, machine learning, have made it possible to do what Nadav was just showing us: have a commercial company that can gather data, that can do it from publicly available sources, can do it from proprietary sources, can set up its own sensor platforms, can set up its own space-based assets, even with the advent of small satellites and things of that nature. And all of a sudden, there's just more ways to do more, get more information. So the monitoring, the breakthrough areas right now are in monitoring. We can share more data. There's more data commercially available to smaller countries. So in Malaysia could simply decide it's going to buy some data from a company like Windward or a company like Hawkeye 360 or a company like Planet Labs or a company, there's a whole, and decide that we're going to use that to help see what's going on in our EEZs. So if you take those policy innovations that we could do unilaterally, aim them towards collaborating with the countries that are most affected, most impacted by these kinds of practices, it's sort of a hybrid of environmental stewardship and monitoring for things like illegal logging or poaching, and what we do on for drug trafficking, for example. You sort of take a hybrid model of that and you do it in partnership, and you leverage these new commercial tools. You really could see a big leap forward in at least the capability to know what's going on, and then start thinking of ways to figure out how to either deter those activities or disrupt those activities in partnership with the affected countries. The trick here, of course, is you really are relying on the impacted countries have to be really in the lead, right? This is not drugs coming to America from South America that we can just go out, detect, and interdict on our own. That partnership has to be there. And I see a lot of innovative thinking and energy being applied towards this from governments, which gives me some hope.
This is so clear and I think to the point, and just maybe to add that those type of technologies, especially on the non-classified realm, are key for the ease of share and the actual applicability of those solutions. So thank you for sharing that. It's actually a great segue maybe to show another quick example of how both the aspect of the geopolitics and technology can show how those methods can be used in order to impact. Nadav, do you want to speak briefly maybe about one of those examples?
Absolutely. I think there are a couple of examples that I think quite clearly illustrate the topic of great power competition and how it applies to different scenarios and use cases, starting from struggles and fights and challenges over territorial claims in certain parts of the world, all the way through the struggle over in combat over natural resources. Just by looking at a recent example from November of 2021, where it was reported, according to open sources, that several boats from the Philippines were trying to provide supplies and goods into a remote island called the Second Thomas Shoal, located slightly outside of the Philippines EEZ. And while those boats were trying to transfer that equipment and supply, they were facing a standoff of several Chinese, both Chinese Coast Guard as well as Chinese fishing vessels that were actually standing in their way and preventing from those vessels to provide the supplies and goods and to transport them into the Second Thomas Shoal. So while Coast Guard vessels, especially Chinese Coast Guard vessels, have often been used to protect the country's interests around the world for many different locations, I think we're also seeing the use of the Chinese distant water fishing fleet being used in a sense of not just by providing power projection, but also to be used for geopolitical events such as this one. And the example that you're seeing here from November 18th of 2021, the use of multiple Chinese fishing vessels in the case of deterioration, and essentially were used in order to drive away Philippine boats that were trying to provide logistical supports and goods to assets on the island. So that would be just as one example of how that distant water fishing fleet could be used as a tool for more of a geopolitical event versus others. But when we're starting to move away from the tactical events and looking at the bird's eye view of what that data means, we can actually start looking at the great power competition from the angle of its economical impact on certain regions and countries in the world. One example that we would like to share with the audience here is actually how much could be seen and done using behavioral data sets in order to better get a better estimate of the amount of jumbo flying squid that is being retrieved by Chinese distant water fishing fleets off the shores of South America. So according to documents that were recently submitted to the SPRFMO on January of 2021, it was reported that China's distant water fishing fleet has retrieved nearly 358,000 metric tons of jumbo flying squid using 427 vessels alone. But when we look at the actual behavioral profile of those squid jiggers, then we can easily translate their movements into insights. Basically, those 126,000 fishing activities that are associated with each and every one of those squid jiggers are easily translated to 53,000 fishing days. Those refer only to vessels that have simply operated their tracking device while conducting fishing operations. And this number excludes any other types of activities that might relate to nefarious behaviors, such as turning off the transponders deliberately in order to avoid detection. So those 53,000 fishing days, these are days where those jiggers have actively been engaged in fishing operations. And we're now just referring to one type of commodity, jumbo flying squid. Now, according to several studies, and looking at the population of those vessels, looking at their size and characteristics, their sizes varies between 40 to 60 meters. They normally catch or conduct their fishing operations at particular timeframes at night to attract the fish, to attract the commodity, to attract the squid using large projectors and lights. And that time frame of fishing could be measured very accurately. Now, according to several studies during that time frame, on average, a Chinese jigger could catch up to 8 tons of jumbo flying squid on average per night. So if we combine those two numbers, the ability of a jigger to retrieve up to 8 tons of squid on average per night, and we compare it to the number of fishing days that could be seen through the platform, then we get to a number that is significantly higher than the reported catch quota that was submitted to the SPRFMO. To be more precise, Windward estimate, if we just simply look at the time periods where those fishing vessels were keeping their transponders on, not trying to avoid detection by either turning them off or conducting a manipulation of their location, which might occur, we're looking at a number that is more close to 425,000 metric tons, which is at least 18% higher than what is actually reported to the RFMO authority. But when we add on top of that additional data sources, things may not make, may start to make better sense in terms of the catch report estimate. Just to kind of add on top of that last point, if we look at the Peruvian jiggers fleet for 2021, just using 109 vessels, which is far less than the size of the Chinese squid jiggers fleet, they've reported catch of 492 metric tons of flying jumbo squid, just using 109 vessels alone. So if we're considering the large amounts of jiggers that operate in this area, at least 441 Chinese fishing vessels, it is hard to believe that they were able to catch only 358,000 metric tons of squid that calendar year. So essentially the difference between what we believe is reported versus our estimate is close to 67,000 metric tons of jumbo flying squid that is actually retrieved and is unreported per year. The economical impact of that on local economies that rely on this commodity can reach up to $81 million. But when we include the dark activities component, which are unique times where those vessels deliberately turn off their transmissions in the open sea in order to avoid detection, then we might get to a higher number or a higher estimation of longer fishing days, which now stands at 67,000 fishing days. And when you multiply those numbers, then you get to at least nearly 540,000 metric tons that could potentially be catched by these 441 squid jiggers. And obviously the impact on local economies is tremendous.
So obviously the impact is dramatic and the scale is alarming. Mark, can I ask your perspective, again, from a very expert point of view, on both the technologies that allowing IUU fishing and how the economical impacts really look like?
Yeah, thanks, Matan. These interesting examples point out the challenge that we're facing and the consequences or the impact of the challenge. Dealing with the challenge is not simple. It starts, in Vikram's world of politics. We need to see, for example, management authorities created off the coast of Argentina. There's a political stalemate, so there's no management. Off the west coast of South America, there is a management organization, the South Pacific Regional FMO, and that's a relatively new management authority. It was put in place in 2012, and they have a challenge. They have to build a structure that can accommodate the need for enforcement, and that begins with simple steps like crafting regulations. The regulations, because we're in international waters, the management authorities don't have a lot of clout. They can't just unilaterally impose a regulation. The regulations are generally agreed upon by consensus of the parties. And the parties include the fishing nations, such as China. And so the management moves slowly by consensus. And they build a structure that begins with some of the simple regulations like reporting catch. When vessels transship their catch, that is, a fishing vessel meets with a refrigerated transport vessel, transport the catch to the second vessel, and then the support vessel takes the catch to China, there's no opportunity for the management authority to monitor or oversee that catch. So there's really no opportunity to evaluate, just are the numbers correct? And that's just a first step. The management authority, the South Pacific Authority, is attempting to put in place regulations on transshipment that just involve oversight, not stopping, but just knowing what's happening. And that's a long step forward, and it hasn't been completed yet. So beyond those regulations, those simple regulations, there's then monitoring. Are the regulations being adhered to? And for a far-flung activity like fishing and then transporting of catch back home to China, the monitoring is a challenge. The good news is that these kinds of processes that take a long time to build are slowly being built worldwide, and they are narrowing the space for IUU to operate. That's one of the reasons why we see more aggressive activity by the Chinese, especially focused in the areas we've been talking about, where management is relatively underdeveloped or non-existent. So the monitoring is hard. If an inspection is to happen at port, fortunately there are new regulations involving port inspections, and the world is actually stepping up to the plate and doing a better job of inspecting fishing vessels when they come to port. For those inspections to be effective, the port inspectors are overwhelmed with the number of ships coming to port, and so they need to know who to target. And that's where this kind of intelligence that Nadav is talking about becomes so important. If a port inspector can be tipped off by, or a national authority can be tipped off by an observation that, hey, here's a vessel that we think is doing something wrong, for whatever that may be, based on the AI and the analytics, then they're not looking for a needle in a haystack. They're not saying, oh my God, I've got 100 vessels to inspect today, and I've got the capability to inspect 2. Who do I choose? Well, the analytics can tip them off. It doesn't have to be concrete, solid proof that this particular vessel is illegal, but rather a risk measure that says, here are the vessel's risk ratings. If you've got 100 vessels coming in, it makes sense to look at the most risky vessels. So that's monitoring. And then comes the hard part, enforcement. And we tend to think of enforcement as going out to sea with a big boat, capturing someone and bringing them home. That's the most expensive and least effective form of fisheries enforcement. The more less sexy, more day-to-day kind of approach of monitoring catch is in some ways better, more effective, more efficient. The vessels out at sea are dispersed and hard to pursue, but they have to come home somewhere. They have to put their catch somewhere. And so the economic enforcement can be really valuable with international collaboration and the right kind of information. we can see a tightening and a restriction, making it harder for illegal fishing and IUU caught fish to enter the marketplace. And so we can provide a disincentive that applies more broadly than just maybe the one boat that can be caught by the Coast Guard. We've got, all 500 vessels having a harder time selling catch that's illegal. And there's a word that's used in seafood world called transparency, traceability, 2 words, to make it clear what seafood comes to port, is it really legal? Both the EU and the US have strongly clamped down on the ability to enforce or the ability to import illegally caught fish or fish that cannot be proven to be caught according to the rules. It's not an ironclad barrier, but it's a restriction, and every step helps. It tightens the system and makes the actors that are operating outside the law have a harder time making a profit from their ill-gotten gains.
Absolutely. And you talked about the traceability and the fact that one of the main challenges to trace fish to plate is the transshipment, and the fact that those fleets transship the cargo, the content, to reefer vessels or to other vessels to carry it onwards. This actually resonates with 2 main, I think, threads that worth highlighting. The first one is the duration of the actual fishing fleet. So if the vessel don't need to get by itself to the port to discharge the cargo or to offload the cargo, then what does it say about the time at sea and some forced labor association or affiliation to that? And maybe we can ask Nadav to showcase one of those examples. And the second thing, which is I think also hidden in plain sight, is if those fishing fleet de facto claims a large body of water and it becomes de facto a territory, what else, which is not not fish that ship through it, is being carried? It can sometimes be a conduit for smuggling event. We have seen some non-commercial, or let's say militarized, affiliation to some of those behaviors in the same areas that de facto are claimed by this body of water. Before maybe our last example, and I know that we're a bit short in time, Vikram, do you want to speak about the non-commercial affiliation, or do you want to mention anything on that aspect?
No, I think we should, these demonstrations that you're going to give, I think are probably the best way to go. I would just mention that I do think the port state measures agreement that is what Mark was referring to. So figuring out how to essentially apply like a airport screening function to fishing vessels as they come to port. I think it's important. And of course, China is not a state party. For I think pretty obvious reasons. So the ability to launder your IUU fishing take remains pretty substantial for the states that see it in their interest to not play by the rules.
Roger. So last example for the day, and obviously there's a lot of questions and we're going to try to answer at least some of them, is maybe a non-commercial conduit or maybe a forced labor affiliation to those extensive amount of time of those fleets to maintain location or harvest an area. Nadav, do you want to speak about this?
Yes, absolutely. I think an area of interest that has received a lot of media attention over the last 2 years have obviously been the Galapagos Island, due to the influx of fishing vessels that have started to operate in the vicinity of the islands. And I think the best example, or the best way to really use behavioral data sets in order to get a better sense of how long vessels stay at sea and use that as a possible indication of forced labor, would be a great example of how this entire ecosystem works. And the idea is to bring more transparency into the maritime ecosystem in order to get a better sense of how that type of event is taking place, maybe just looking from the data perspective. Now, what we're doing right now is that we're querying a given area, a particular area located next to the Galapagos Island, to look for the current locations of Chinese fishing vessels that currently operate in the Galapagos Island as we speak, and we run this demo. As of now, there are 228 vessels that operate Chinese jiggers. These are all specifically Chinese jiggers that operate off the Galapagos Island as of now. A question or a key question that needs to be asked when it comes to understanding forced labor would be the amount of time these vessels simply spend out at sea. If we then take that number and try to see how many vessels among that particular fleet have actually visited a port in the last 6 months, then we're going to get better clarity of whether the vast majority of the fleet actually goes back home to transfer the cargo, to deliver the goods, to move crew members from one boat to another, versus how many of those vessels actually spend a tremendous amount of time at sea without going into any port. And this is just by simply looking at the last 6 months alone. Now, the numbers show that we have about 30 vessels out of the 228 vessels that have have actually visited a port in the last 6 months, which means that we still have about 198 vessels that have not gone into a port during that same time period. So if we take a look at that number of 198 vessels, these are all examples of vessels that should have gone home to transfer their cargo, to transfer their catch, but they stand for the vast majority of vessels that operate in the region that haven't gone home. So question remains, how on earth do these vessels continue to operate next to the Galapagos Island without actually making a single port visit? The answer lies with the ability to look at the traceability of those vessels and seeing how they're actually operating at sea. What I'm doing now is I'm essentially asking the system a question to be able to identify who among these 198 vessels that didn't go home for the past 6 months, who among those vessels have actually conducted a ship-to-ship operation where the fish or the catch has been actually moved from one port to another, but between two vessels. And you can see that those 198 vessels have all conducted ship-to-ship operations off areas that are considered to be hotspots for illegal fishing, both next to Argentina, where there's obviously a large population of squid, as well as next to the Galapagos Island. If we just simply go and pick and choose one of those events, we'll be able to see how this entire operation takes place. So for example, I just randomly selected an event of a ship-to-ship operation between a Chinese fishing vessel and a foreign flagged reefer. If we simply take a look at that particular example, then we start to get better visibility of how long these vessels actually spend time at sea and how are they able to maintain their operations. If we simply start by looking at the Chinese fishing vessel that we've just randomly selected, we'll be able to see that if we look at the date of its last port call, the last reported port call for that vessel, that has occurred on June 2nd, 2021. So more than a year ago, this is the amount of time that this vessel spends out at sea, right? Just kind of like not going into ports, not doing anything outside of fishing. This is actually an illustration of its track line from the past year. And as we said, as a way for us to provide better visibility into how they are able to maintain their presence in the open sea, the question still remains of how this happens, right? So essentially, if we go back to kind of our initial question, we were asking about ship-to-ship operations, and that vessel was brought up to our attention because it was simply meeting with another cargo reefer at that time on May 28th, which is essentially a date of the meeting that occurred a few days ago. So I'm pulling the information right now just so we can get a better visual representation of the event. So right now we're representing the patterns of both vessels at the same time. This event is not unique to those two vessels alone. This is exactly how those 198 vessels maintain their operations at sea. And as you can see, the foreign flagged reefer that has picked up that cargo has then later left the area, changed its reported draft indicating that it picked up cargo on board the vessel, and left on its way to Zhoushan, where it's likely to unload its cargo. And this entire ecosystem does not just happen with one target, it happens with many. And perhaps I'd like to pass the baton perhaps over to Matan in regards to maybe the importance of looking at these foreign flag reefers as perhaps another segue or a possibility for more enforcement.
Yeah, so obviously to stay for this amount of time at sea, it's inhumane, and the condition obviously on those vessels, small vessels, are very poor. So when we are thinking about forced labor, unfortunately, this is how it usually looks. The reefer here, and by the way, other type of vessels, as per Mark's comment, that are part of the supply chain here, fuel the whole operation, literally. It can be chemical tankers that give the diesel. It can be the reefer that take the catch. But in essence, those are part of the operation. It is important to highlight that the supporting fleet, as you've seen it, are non-Chinese flagged vessels. So from the enforcement standpoint, and this is back to Vikram's point, which is, I think, very important, this is something that can be easier to enforce if eventually decided to. We are getting closer to the end of our session. There's so many important topics that we haven't had the chance to cover still, and we would love to follow up afterwards if you have any additional questions or topics, starting from a long distance and how the operation works, the traceability aspect, the unregulated and unreported aspect, and obviously the non-commercial. We are open book and happy to share and discuss. Before we adjourn this, I would like to pass this back to my distinguished guest and see if you have any closing remarks. Mark, maybe we start with you, sir. Anything that you would like to share before we close this session today?
Yeah, thanks, Matan. I think it's been a good overview. The depth of these issues really requires, many hours if we were to try to go through everything completely. But it's phenomenal to see. I think I'm optimistic. I'm generally an optimistic person. I'm optimistic on this issue with new laws, with new regulations, with new international agreements coming into force, and with development of analytics and increased international cooperation. I think we are seeing the opportunity shrink for IUU fishing. There's more that can be done, and it doesn't have to be the canonical boat going out and seizing a vessel and taking it back to port, which is, as I've always heard from the people who do those operations, the most expensive and least effective form of enforcement. So with all the tools put together, the analytics and the new regulations and the better cooperation, I think we are seeing progress. And so this kind of conversation, to work together to share information and insights, I think is a great tool for advancing the cause, and I'm optimistic for the future.
I want to share the optimism and obviously the fact that we are talking about this actively and there's more voices. It's very assuring. There's kind of always the aspect of the accuracy of the data and how we can be sure that this is the ground truth. And obviously there is a portion of a common operating picture, especially if we are talking on cross country efforts and international efforts. Vikram, any closing remarks from policy standpoint or from your unique standpoint?
Well, I mean, I do think I agree with Mark in terms of being optimistic. I think the thing that worries me is just the scale of the challenge more than the will. A few years ago, I would have said there wasn't much will, but you do see, both multilateral efforts like the ones we've been discussing, and then also, things like major markets, Europe and the United States, using their leverage to pressure countries to step up their own enforcement, their own compliance, modernize their own regulations. As you've seen, for example, the EU pushing on Panama to step up its capabilities and its legal frameworks. So big markets, China has the big market and the big capabilities, but the large markets of the United States, Europe, and Southeast Asia itself, by saying like we're not going to put up with being consumers of these products, can also apply a lot of market pressure to help reduce it, at least in terms of what reaches the plates of their own consumers. China's size and the fact that a lot of this would end up just going to China directly if the world steps up its enforcement very well. That leaves you some worry too. But I think the pressure on China to not be essentially a global pariah in the long run could also have a constructive impact. But we are what Nadav has shown is we're going from being relatively blind, especially for those countries that didn't have their own intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance assets that they could use for this mission. We're going from being blind to being able to see because of things like what you guys have just demonstrated. Nadav didn't show that you even can, you can look at those things like the meetings between deployed distant fishing vessels and the ships that come to service them or conduct the transshipment operations. You guys can even click and show photographs of those vessels, right? I mean, so information is going to be power when it comes to enforcement. It's not going to be like James Bond and fast boats and helicopters and raids and boarding operations. It's going to be steady sort of closing of the noose around these guys, less places to go, better enforcement when they come to port, more pressure for human rights for the tens of thousands of people that are in the industry and being exploited. And I think that really has a potential this decade for us to see substantial progress. And the world is seized with the plight of the oceans from just human welfare, sustainability, really a survival standpoint. Let's see that whether it's plastic pollution, so I think we're seeing a lot of creativity. We're seeing the tech world, industry, the fishing industry, and governments that realize how important this is, stepping up to take a lot more action. So I think it's a good time to be involved, and it's great to see companies like yours able to bring to this fight. It's been a pleasure to talk to you guys, and Mark, really great to meet you as well.
Yes.
Would like to thank you greatly for both the time and the insight. I think we all agree that the sunlight is the best disinfectant here, and to start with just bringing visibility and increase the knowledge, and then the rest would follow. So with that, thank you very much again, and for all the participants, we would love to follow up if there's any follow-up questions. And Vikram, Mark, Nadav, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a genuine pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.